everyone and welcome, and I'm really excited about this month's topic because we are going over to the dark side. And by the dark side, I'm talking shadows. So as you know, without light, there can be no shadows. So last month we focused our efforts on learning about how to paint light. And we talked about having warm light and cool shadows. And cool light gives us warm shadows. Now we're going to put it all together this month and talk more about painting shadows. And what I really want to do is share with you some tips and techniques and ideas to help you paint shadows that are much more believable, much more natural feeling. Because a lot of times when we struggle with shadows and we end up making them too dark and we end up with shadows that look black or gray and they look like either holes in our painting or maybe things that we cut out and pasted on. And I'm going to talk about why that happens, and I'm going to give you some solutions so that you don't end up with those black holes for shadows. Probably the biggest reason we run into trouble with painting shadows is when we are working from photos. Because as we know, photos lie. They don't always capture the subtleties that our eye sees. So in other words, if we were outside looking at shadows, we would see much more color and light in those shadows. And then when we look at that same subject in a photograph, the shadows often look black. And then we're literal when we copy what we see in our photo, and that's how come we end up with those dark, heavy shadows that look like they are holes in our paper. So photos are one of the big problems that we run into, and I think I'm going to give you some solutions to help you get around that. But let's first look at some photos. I have a couple of photos up on my board to show you what I'm talking about. And in this one here, the shadows that are under these lifeguard chairs are interesting, but they're very dark, almost black, or I might say very, very dark gray, if not black. And there's some shadow shapes in here that look black. We're actually going to be talking not just about cast shadows, so these are shadows cast by an object, but we're going to be talking about shadowed areas. In other words, areas within the subject that is not facing the light, away from the light. So, for example, let's look at this tree. In the shadowed areas, the areas that are hidden by the sunlit areas, look how dark they look, almost black. If I was painting that and I was being very literal to that tree trunk, I probably would use black or very, very dark pastel, maybe that Terry Ludwig eggplant that we like to use so much. This is the cast shadow of the tree. Notice a couple things about it. It's not only is it very, very dark, but it's very hard-edged, meaning there's no softness to it. So it looks like a big dark worm shape that has been cut out and pasted on the photo. These are both instances of where the photo is not being totally accurate and underexposing those shadows and shadowed areas. This photo right here is another good example. Look how dark all this shadowed area is in the tree, and the cast shadow, it almost looks black, especially in this area here. And I have painted this, and I've painted the bad version, and I'm going to talk about making it into a better version in just a few minutes. What do we do sometimes when we paint shadows and we're looking at the photo and we say, well, that's a black shape, so I'm going to make my shadow shape black. So here again, this is the bad version of the painting, and I made the shadow shape very, very dark, almost black. This happens to be a Terry Ludwig eggplant, super dark pastel. But oftentimes I will see artists who will paint their shadows dark gray. And here's an example of that same shadow shape in a dark gray. And it just looks like a puddle of dark gray. It's not very believable. I've also often, and I used to do this myself, paint shadows dark violet. So here's an example of that same shadow in a darker violet, dark purple. And again, you're getting closer to having a more believable shadow, but it's not quite there. Another thing that we often do is paint shadow shapes dark blue. So here's an example of that same shadow shape in a dark blue. And I think out of all of them, this is the closest to having a more believable shadow. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. So this is wrong. These are probably not your best choices either. So how are we going to paint a better version of the shadow? What I'm going to do before I actually show you is I'm going to talk about some things that we can do to paint better shadows. So the first thing we want to do to consider the shadow is we want to consider the value of the shadow. In other words, how dark are we going to make it? And we've already established that we don't need it to be the darkest value we own, because we would see more light with our naked eye if we were looking at that in the real life. And that leads me to say this: the very best thing that you can do to help you paint more believable shadows is to get outside and observe the shadows. Even better, paint them from life. But if you don't want to do that or can't do that, at least go out there and describe those shadows to yourself with art words. Ask yourself, what color do I see? What value do I see in those shadows? What's happening to the edges of those shadows? Because the more we feed our brain with the information that we see visually, the more we'll be able to take bad photos and make them into better paintings. So look at the value of a shadow, and what we realize is shadows are never really as dark as they are in the photo. And what usually happens with a shadow is they're darkest at the base of the object, but as the shadow moves away from the object, it will get a little bit lighter. So we want to vary the value, transition it to getting it a little bit lighter. The other thing we want to look for is the edges of the shadow. And shadow shapes, sometimes they're very hard edged. It depends on where the light source is, where the sun is. But more often, as the shadow moves away from the shape, it becomes softer and more diffused. So we'll get softer edges towards the outer boundaries of that shadow. So that's something to consider. The other thing is to talk about the color of the shadows. And I just showed you some examples of colors that we typically will paint shadows, and while they're not the absolute best solution, let's go back to that idea of warm light equals cool shadows. Or if you have a cooler light, you'll have warm shadows. And before you get too nervous about that idea, that because to me it took me a really long time to make that make sense. It seems very simple, a simple equation, but then to put it into practice, I had to think too hard. So I have a little tip for you, that if you just follow these directions, you don't have to worry so much about warm light, cool shadows, or cool light, warm shadows, because it will automatically happen. Okay? And that way you don't have to panic and say, oh wait, I can't remember all that, because I certainly couldn't remember all that. So here's the I guess you could call it a trick. Cast shadows, that is, the shadows that an object casts on the ground. The color of a cast shadow is going to be a darker value of the surface that is being cast upon. Let me explain that a little bit better. Let's look at the tree for an example. This cast shadow should be a darker value of the surface that it's being cast upon, meaning if the shadow crosses green grass, it's going to be a dark green. Where it crosses a yellow path, it will be a darker yellow. Where it crosses the green again, it'll be a darker green. So you're basically going to take the value of the surface where the shadow is and say, I just need to make that a darker value. And then one other addition, and this is the fun part. Because you have light in the sky, there'll be sun, that means the sky is going to be blue, which means that blue sky will influence the shadow. So not only will it be a darker version of the land that it's being cast upon, it will have that influence of the cool blue sky. So instead of painting the shadow just blue, if you make it a dark green and then scumble lightly that blue on top of that, you will get the best of both worlds. So darker version of the surface that the shadow is cast upon with the influence of the blue of the sky. Now, I'm going to show you how that works in practice. One other thing I wanted to say about shadows. Oftentimes we will see less detail in the shadowed areas. Sometimes if the light is very, very bright, you won't see detail in those really lit areas, but more often than not, you won't see as much detail in the darker shadowed areas. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm not going to repaint the whole painting, because really all I need to do is fix the shadowed areas. So the first thing I'm going to do so I can restore a little bit of tooth is take my stiff brush and I'm going to just brush out the dark shadow. And I also put really dark shadows in the distance because I saw it in my photo. And that's not usually a good reason to put something in your painting because you see it in the photo. Do you see by removing those dark shapes in the distance how I automatically pushed that area back? It feels like it's further back now. Alright, now let's fix the shadow. I think I'm going to give it a quick spray of workable fixative just so that I can get a little texture going in the grass. Alright, so before I address the shadow, let's fix the trunk, the tree trunk, because I made it one big dark shape. And I need to let you guys know that the light is coming from your upper left. So the upper left is giving sunlight, which means the shadow's being cast off to the right. And that's another really important tip for painting shadows. You need to be aware of where your light source is coming from, and you need to be consistent with where your shadows are going, where they're being cast. And oftentimes when we are making changes to our reference photos, we have to take into consideration if we are changing shadows and light sources that we are consistent with the direction of our cast shadows. They should all be going in the same direction. So I added a little bit of light purple to the sunlit side of the tree trunk. It's still very much in the shadows. There's only really light at the top part of the tree, but I had it much too dark. So this shadow is going across green grass. So what do we have to do? We need a darker value of green. So I'm going to pick a dark green to paint this shadow shape. And then where it crosses the path, I have to change the green. But then it comes back over the grass again, so I'm going to add that dark green right over the grass. Now, I really feel like this is still a little too dark, so let's get a little bit lighter green. And I'm going to soften the edges of the shadow where it comes across and moves further away from the tree. So you see how I just kind of mingled some of the lighter green in so that it kind of dissipated and made the shadow more diffused. All right, so what are we going to do with this shadow where it crosses the path? Well, we first have to ask ourselves, well, what color is that pathway? In my photo, it looks very white, but I remember being there that it was more of a kind of golden sand. So that means it's yellow. It's like a gold color. So I need a darker value of yellow. So let's see what I have over here. Let's see. There's a dark yellow. So I'm going to darken that area right in there. And I'm not so sure that that's quite dark enough. So let's make it a little bit darker. And where did the green kind of sneaks into that path, so I'm going to pull out the green and sneak some more of it just to make it more, a little softer edges. So this is one part of the equation, darker value of the surface it's being cast upon, and now we need to give that influence of the sky. So if the sky is blue, it's going to affect and cool off the shadow a little bit, so I can pick a blue. Let's start with a darkish blue, and this is the scumble part. So scumble just means to very, very lightly go over your shadow with a little bit of that blue. And you want to use such a light touch that you don't even really, that you want to be able to see the green and the orange underneath. And I kind of covered it up, so I'm going to go back over it with the green and the yellow. Sometimes you have to go back and forth to get it right. Now we want to look at and address the edges of the shadow shape. They're going to be darker and harder edge closer to the object. So I'm going to go in and kind of darken the shadow right directly under the tree. Make sure my edges are nice and sharp or hard, and make sure they stay diffused. And then I'm going to say, well, we could have a little bit of detail within that shadow. So let's just take some of the green that's in the grass, some of this brighter green, and bring it right up to the edge of that shadow, just so that we can see a little bit of the detail of those grasses. I can make a little bit of grass marks. And I'm going to post this photo in with the description of this video, so you'll be able to get a closer look at how it all comes together. I'm just going to soften that top edge of the shadow right over in there. Alright, so now you have, I feel, is a much more believable, beautiful looking shadow. It's not just that one big dark hard edge shape. It's a shadow that looks like it's actually truly part of that landscape and not something that I've added on at the end. So a darker version of the surface. So I used a darker green, a darker yellow, another dark green, and I scumbled, meaning I used a very, very light touch of blue on top of the shadow so that those colors all optically blend together to create a more colorful shadow. You could use blue violet, you could use violet, but notice I don't just use one color to make the shadow, I make several colors in there. So that's the secret for more believable cast shadows, and we're going to talk more about this, and I'm going to give more demos in the days to come, but I hope this tip has been helpful.